People always think the most dangerous creature in a mafia boss's life is the mafia boss. They're usually wrong. Sometimes, it's the dog. Loki wasn't just a pit bull. He was a legend. 4 trainers had quit. 2 bodyguards still carried scars across their arms. 1 veterinarian had refused to ever come back. Even the city's toughest gangsters stepped out of his way when they heard the heavy clink of the thick chain around his neck. Rumor said Loki hated everyone. Women, men, children, other dogs, didn't matter. If you got too close, you bled. Which was exactly why Abigail Brooks nearly dropped an entire tray of milkshakes when she walked out of Riverside Diner that Tuesday afternoon. The sidewalk exploded into screams. "He got loose!" People scattered in every direction. Chairs crashed onto the pavement. Someone dove behind a parked car. A businessman abandoned his briefcase without a second thought. And charging straight toward Abby was nearly 90 pounds of pure muscle, teeth, and fury. She should have run. Anyone with common sense would have. Instead, she sighed. "Oh, sweetheart," she muttered. "Somebody has really ruined your day." The people watching thought she'd lost her mind. The gigantic pit bull was only a few feet away now. His growl vibrated through the sidewalk. His jaws opened. Abby didn't scream, didn't flinch, didn't even take another step backward. She simply lifted one hand, like a disappointed kindergarten teacher. Absolutely not. Silence. The impossible happened. Loki stopped so suddenly, his paws scraped against the concrete. His ears twitched. His tail, stiff only seconds earlier, gave one uncertain wag. Then another. The enormous pit bull slowly walked forward, lowered his massive head, and gently rested it against Abby's stomach, like he'd been looking for her his entire life. No one moved. No one breathed. Across the street, a 6'4" man in a black tailored suit stared in complete disbelief. Because that wasn't just any dog. That was his dog. And for the first time in 5 years, Loki had trusted someone besides him. Dante Romano had spent years trying to understand what fear could never teach. A complete stranger had solved it in less than 30 seconds. What neither of them knew was that the reason Loki chose Abby had nothing to do with fate. It had everything to do with a secret someone inside Dante's empire had been desperate to bury. Before we rewind to that Tuesday afternoon and find out exactly why Loki chose her, if you believe animals can sense things about people that the rest of us are too busy or too scared to notice, hit subscribe, because Loki's about to prove it in a way that changes everything for everyone in this story. And tell me in the comments, have you ever watched an animal instantly trust or distrust someone and later find out they were completely right? Also, drop where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far this story travels. Type, "I love dogs," below if Abby just became your favorite heroine in under a minute. Now, let's go back to an ordinary lunch shift at Riverside Diner, before anyone knew Loki was about to change 2 lives forever. Abby Brooks had a rule about Tuesdays. If you survived the lunch rush without crying in the walk-in freezer, it counted as a win. She'd survived. She'd survived. Barely. 6 tables, 2 screaming toddlers, and a man who'd sent back his eggs 3 times before, finally admitting he just wanted to complain to someone. "You look like you need a cigarette," Rosa Martinez said, wiping down the counter with the particular ferocity she reserved for slow afternoons. "And you don't even smoke." "I'm considering starting, purely for the drama of it." Abby balanced a tray of half-melted milkshakes, heading for the door to bust the outdoor tables before the ice cream became a permanent stain on someone's patio furniture. Back in 5, the street outside buzzed with its usual midday rhythm. Foot traffic, honking cabs, the diner's faded awning throwing long shadows across the sidewalk tables. Abby had just set the tray down when the screaming started. "He got loose." The words hit the block like a struck match, chaos igniting in every direction at once. Chairs scraped and toppled. A woman abandoned her stroller mid-push, snatching her toddler up and sprinting. A businessman dropped his briefcase entirely, papers scattering across the pavement as he dove behind a parked sedan. Abby turned toward the commotion and felt her stomach drop. 90 pounds of muscle and fury was barreling down the sidewalk directly toward her. A massive brindle pit bull, chain leash dragging loose and clattering behind him, jaws open, a low, rolling growl vibrating through the concrete itself. Behind him, a tall man in a black tailored suit sprinted after the trailing leash, shouting something Abby couldn't make out over the screaming. She'd heard about this dog. Everyone on this block had. Loki. The mafia boss's monster. The dog 4 trainers had quit on. The dog nobody dared get close to. She had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do, and every ounce of common sense screamed at her to run. She didn't run. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, past the bared teeth and the terrified crowd, and saw something underneath the fury that made her chest ache instead of race. His ears weren't pinned back in aggression. They were flat with fear. His stride wasn't a hunting charge. It was frantic, uneven, the gait of something running from, rather than, toward. "Oh, sweetheart," she muttered, setting the milkshake tray down slow and deliberate. "Somebody has really ruined your day." The dog closed the last stretch of sidewalk in a blur, and Abby lifted one hand, palm out, calm, unhurried, the exact gesture she'd use on an unruly toddler who needed to understand the conversation was over. Absolutely not. The words weren't loud. She didn't shout them. She simply said them the way you'd say them to someone you fully expected to listen. Loki's paws scraped hard against the pavement, skidding to a stop close enough that Abby felt his breath against her knuckles, close enough that a dozen onlookers gasped in unison, certain they were about to witness something they'd spend years describing to strangers. His ears twitched. His stiff, raised tail gave one small, uncertain wag. Then another. And then, to the disbelief of every single person frozen on that sidewalk, the enormous dog lowered his massive head and pressed it gently against Abby's stomach, leaning his full weight into her, like he'd been searching for exactly this moment his entire life. Abby let out a slow breath and rested her hand lightly against the top of his head, careful, unhurried. "There we go," she murmured. "That's better, isn't it?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Somewhere behind her, she heard Rosa's frying pan clatter to the diner floor. Dante Romano arrived a full 10 seconds later, breathing hard, his usual composed authority entirely absent as he skidded to a stop several feet away, staring at the scene in front of him with an expression Abby suspected didn't cross his face often. Disbelief. He didn't. Dante's voice came out rougher than she imagined he intended. "He hasn't let anyone touch him. Not a trainer. Not a vet. Not in years. Maybe he just has better manners than most of your customers." Abby scratched gently behind Loki's ear, and the dog leaned harder into her hand, eyes half closed now in something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. He wasn't attacking, for what it's worth. He was terrified. There's a difference. If you know what to look for. You knew that. In under 30 seconds. I grew up around rescue dogs. You learn to read fear pretty fast, or you get bitten a lot. She glanced up at him, taking in the tailored suit, the tension still radiating off his broad shoulders, the way the entire street seemed to have gone quiet and careful around him even now. Dog crisis, apparently secondary to his presence. "You're the owner, I take it." Dante Romano. He said it like it should mean something. It didn't. Not particularly. Not to her. "Abby Brooks." She nodded toward the leash, still dragging behind Loki. "You might want to invest in a better clasp. This one looks like it gave up on the job about 3 blocks back." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, clearly unfamiliar territory, for a man who looked like he rarely let anything reach his mouth uninvited. "I'll take that under advisement," he said, and for one brief, startling moment, something close to real amusement broke through his composed exterior. Loki chose that exact moment to lift his head from Abby's stomach, ears suddenly pinning flat again, a low, fresh growl building in his throat. Not directed at Abby this time, but past her, toward the man now approaching from across the street, silver-haired, composed, dressed in the same dark, understated style as Dante's security detail. "Marco?" Dante said, some of his earlier warmth vanishing instantly, replaced by sharp, focused attention. "Get his leash. Carefully." Loki's growl deepened, his whole body going rigid beneath Abby's hand, every trace of the calm she'd coaxed out of him evaporating in an instant as the man called Marco drew closer. Abby felt the shift beneath her palm, genuine fear, sharper and more specific than anything she'd witnessed on the sidewalk moments earlier, and glanced up to find Dante watching his own head of security with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something was very wrong here. She just didn't yet understand what. Marco Bellini crouched slowly, retrieving Loki's trailing leash with practiced, careful movements, though Abby noticed the dog's entire body remained rigid beneath her hand, a low growl still humming in his throat until Marco finally straightened and stepped back. "Apologies for the disturbance," Marco said, his voice smooth, professionally pleasant, entirely at odds with the tension still radiating off the dog beside her. "He's been unpredictable lately. We'll have him properly restrained going forward." "He seemed pretty predictable to me," Abby said, before she could stop herself. "Scared. That's usually pretty predictable." Marco's smile didn't waver, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Brooks." "Abby Brooks. Miss Brooks. I'll take it from here." He reached for the leash's clasp near Loki's collar, and the dog flinched so violently he nearly knocked Abby sideways, a sharp yelp cutting through the street's slowly returning noise. "Careful," Abby said sharply, steadying herself, one hand automatically moving to calm Loki's shaking shoulders. "You're spooking him. He's a dog, Miss Brooks, not a particularly complicated creature to manage, once you understand the correct methods." Marco's tone stayed pleasant, though something colder had crept beneath it. "I've handled him for 5 years. Sure hasn't stuck, has it?" The words left her before she could soften them, and she watched Marco's composed expression tighten fractionally before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. Dante, watching the exchange with careful, unreadable attention, finally stepped forward. "Marco, take him back to the estate. I'll follow shortly." Marco nodded, though his eyes lingered on Abby a moment longer than necessary before he led Loki away, the dog casting one final, reluctant glance back over his shoulder, straining briefly against the leash toward her before Marco's firm tug redirected him down the block. He returned to Riverside Diner 3 days later. Abby spotted him the moment he walked through the door, considerably harder to miss than the average lunch customer. 6'4", tailored black suit entirely out of place among the diner's cracked vinyl booths and laminated menus, every head in the restaurant turning to track his path toward the counter. "You're stalking my diner," Abby said, sliding a menu toward him without waiting to be asked. "That's generally considered a red flag on a first date." "This isn't a date. Then it's definitely stalking. I should probably charge extra." Something flickered across his face, close enough to amusement that Abby counted it a small victory. "I came to thank you. Properly, for Tuesday." "You already thanked me. Sort of. In that very serious mafia boss way where you barely say the actual words but the sentiment is technically implied." "I'd like to say it properly this time." He settled onto the stool across the counter, looking distinctly uncomfortable, perched on cracked red vinyl. "Loki hasn't let anyone besides me touch him in over a year. Marco included, most days, unless he's using specific equipment." "Equipment?" Abby's brow furrowed. "What kind of equipment does a dog trainer need that requires the dog to be handled like it's defusing a bomb?" "I don't ask Marco about his methods. He's been effective at keeping Loki contained. Contained isn't the same as trained." Abby crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. There's a difference between a dog who trusts you and a dog who's just too scared to do anything else. From what I saw Tuesday, your Loki's the second kind. Dante studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his dark eyes. You said something similar on the street, that he was scared, not aggressive. Because he was. Fear and aggression look almost identical to people who don't know what they're looking at, but they're not the same thing at all. A truly aggressive dog doesn't slam to a stop the second someone tells him no with any real conviction. He tests you, pushes. A scared dog just wants somebody to finally make the noise stop. What noise? I don't know yet. But something's making that dog flinch at things nobody else seems to notice. She refilled his water glass without being asked, an old habit from years of reading customers who'd never admit what they actually wanted. Has he always been like this? Aggressive, I mean? 5 years. Since he was a year old. Dante's jaw tightened slightly. He was different as a puppy. Playful. My father used to say he had the worst guard dog instincts he'd ever seen in a breed built for exactly that job. What changed? My father died 5 years ago. He said it flatly. The particular careful neutrality of a wound that had never properly closed. Loki changed shortly after. We assumed it was grief. Dogs feel lost too. Maybe, Abby's brow furrowed, something uneasy stirring in her chest that she couldn't quite name yet. Or maybe something happened around that same time that had nothing to do with grief at all. She visited the Romano estate 2 days later, an invitation extended with careful, formal politeness that Abby suspected cost Dante more effort than he'd ever admit. Loki met her in the estate's private courtyard, and the moment he caught her scent, his entire demeanor transformed, ears lifting, tail wagging in wide, unrestrained arcs as he crossed the distance between them, at an eager trot, rather than the frantic, terrified charge she'd witnessed days earlier. "Hey, handsome!" Abby crouched low, letting him close the final distance on his own terms, and Loki pressed his head into her palm with a low, contented groan. "Look at you, considerably less terrifying today." "He's been calmer since Tuesday," Dante admitted, watching from a few feet away, with an expression Abby was beginning to recognize as genuine bewilderment. "I've never seen him settle this quickly around anyone." Abby's hands moved gently along Loki's neck, adjusting his collar to check the fit, and stopped entirely, her fingers catching against something raw and healing hidden just beneath the leather. She lifted the collar carefully, and Loki flinched, whining low in his throat. Beneath the leather, half hidden by his thick fur, was a cluster of small, scarred wounds, old enough to have partially healed, fresh enough that a few still looked tender to the touch. Abby's stomach turned to ice. "Dante." Her voice had gone quiet, careful. "Who has been hurting your dog?" Dante went very still, the color draining slightly from his face, as he crossed the courtyard in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her to examine the wounds himself, his expression shifting from confusion into something considerably darker. Dante's fingers hovered over the marks beneath Loki's collar without quite touching them, his jaw working, something dangerous settling behind his composed exterior. "These are recent," he said quietly. "Some of them. Others have been healing for a while." Abby kept her voice gentle, matching the careful stillness she used on frightened animals, though her heart hammered with a fury she was working hard to keep out of her tone. "Dante, these aren't accidental. This is a pattern. Someone's been doing this to him deliberately, and for a while. Marco handles his care personally. He's the only one with regular, unsupervised access." Dante's voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way Abby was beginning to recognize meant something dangerous was moving beneath the surface. "He's been with this family 15 years. I'm not accusing anyone of anything I can't prove yet." Abby smoothed her hand along Loki's neck, and the dog leaned into her touch, eyes half closed with the particular relief of an animal, finally, briefly, feeling safe. "I'm telling you what I see. A dog who's terrified of a specific sound, who flinches at handling from anyone but you, and who has scars hidden under a collar that's supposed to be protecting him, not hurting him. Dante was quiet for a long moment, watching Loki settle further against Abby's legs, tail thumping softly against the courtyard stones. "Would you be willing to spend more time with him?" he said finally. "Officially, I'll compensate you properly, whatever your schedule requires. I don't need to be paid to help a scared animal, Dante. I'd prefer to pay you regardless." Something almost stubborn entered his voice. "I don't ask people for favors easily. It's simpler for me if this stays a professional arrangement." Abby studied him for a moment, something in his careful phrasing giving her pause. "Is that actually about payment? Or is that about you being uncomfortable, owing someone something you can't easily repay?" Something flickered across his face. Caught, though he recovered quickly. "Does it matter which?" "Not really." She scratched behind Loki's ear, considering. "Fine. Professional arrangement. But I get full access to his training records, his vet history, anything Marco's documented about his behavior over the years. If I'm going to figure out what's actually wrong with him, I need the whole picture, not just what he shows me on a good day." "I'll have everything sent to you." The records arrived 2 days later, delivered by a quiet, efficient assistant who left them at Riverside Diner during Abby's afternoon lull, and she spread them across an empty booth once the last lunch customer had cleared out, Rosa refilling her coffee with visible curiosity. "Reading up on your mafia boss's homework?" Rosa asked. "His dog's homework, technically." Abby flipped through pages of Marco's careful, clinical notes. Training logs, behavioral assessments, incident reports stretching back years. Something's off about all of this. Off how? Every single incident report describes Loki as unprovoked, aggressive without cause. Abby tapped a page dated 18 months earlier. But look at the timing. Every incident happens right after a training session with Marco. Not before. Not during normal handling by anyone else. Always right after. Rosa leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the dense paragraphs. Maybe the training sessions are just stressful for him. Maybe, Abby's frown deepened. Or maybe whatever's happening in those sessions is exactly what's making him dangerous afterward. She returned to the estate 3 days a week after that, an arrangement that settled into an easy, comfortable rhythm. Long afternoons in the courtyard, gentle exercises designed to rebuild trust rather than demand obedience. Loki growing calmer and more relaxed with each visit, until his tail wagged the instant her car pulled through the gates. Dante began finding excuses to be present for at least part of every visit. "You don't actually need to supervise me," Abby told him on her 4th visit. Watching him settle onto the courtyard bench with a laptop he clearly had no intention of opening. "I promise I'm not smuggling state secrets out in my apron pockets. I'm working." "You've had that laptop closed for 20 minutes. "I'm thinking about working." Something almost sheepish crossed his expression. Entirely unfamiliar territory for a man Abby suspected rarely allowed himself to look anything other than composed. "Loki responds better when I'm nearby, I've noticed. He responds better to me because I'm not trying to fix him. I'm just letting him exist without demanding anything from him first." Abby settled onto the grass beside the dog, letting him rest his heavy head across her lap. "You could try that, you know. With people too, not just dogs." "Is that a professional observation or a personal one?" "Bit of both, probably." She smiled, unbothered by his careful, assessing gaze. "You're not nearly as unreadable as you think you are, Dante Romano. You just don't get a lot of practice being read." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, but close. A man encountering an observation he hadn't invited and wasn't entirely sure how to deflect. "You have opinions about everyone, apparently. Only the interesting ones." She glanced up at him, something warm and teasing in her tone. "You should feel flattered." He didn't answer immediately, though something in his posture eased slightly, and Loki, sensing the shift, lifted his head and nudged insistently against Dante's knee until he reluctantly reached down to scratch behind the dog's ear. He's never done that before, Dante said quietly. Initiated contact with someone else present. Usually it's only me, or lately, only you. Maybe he's finally figuring out you two aren't in competition. Abby watched the dog lean contentedly between them, tail thumping against the grass. Dogs pick up on tension between people they care about. If he senses you're comfortable with me being here, he relaxes more too. Dante was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on Loki's head, something thoughtful and uncertain crossing his face. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel comfortable with. Exactly, he said finally, quiet enough that Abby suspected he hadn't fully intended to say it aloud. Before she could respond, Loki's ears suddenly pricked upward, his whole body going rigid, a low whine building in his throat as a distant, high-pitched electronic beeping echoed faintly from somewhere near the estate's training facility across the grounds. The dog scrambled backward, pressing himself hard against Abby's side, trembling violently, eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with anything visible in the courtyard at all. Abby's blood ran cold, watching the dog's reaction unfold in real time, not fear of a person, not fear of a raised hand or a loud voice, but fear of a sound so specific, so precisely triggered, that it could only mean one thing. Someone had trained him to be afraid of it. Loki didn't calm down for nearly 10 minutes. Abby held him through the worst of it, murmuring low and steady while his whole body shook against her. Dante crouched on his other side with an expression Abby had never seen on him before. Not the composed authority he wore like armor, but something raw, helpless, watching his own dog tremble at a sound neither of them could fully explain. That beeping, Dante said finally, once Loki's breathing had slowed. That came from the training facility, where Marco works with him. Yes. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. Father Michael arrived the following afternoon, a retired veterinarian, with silver hair and gentle, unhurried hands, whom Abby had called the moment she'd gotten home the night before, still shaken by what she'd witnessed. Your grandfather used to bring me dogs just like this, he told Abby, kneeling slowly beside Loki in the courtyard, letting the dog approach him on his own terms before attempting any contact at all. Abused animals, conditioned to associate specific stimuli with pain. It's called classical conditioning. Cruel but effective if someone wants to control an animal's behavior without leaving obvious marks. What kind of stimuli are we talking about? Dante asked, his voice tight. Could be almost anything. Sound, most commonly, in cases like this, ultrasonic frequencies humans can barely register, but dogs hear clearly. Pair that frequency consistently with pain, and eventually, the sound alone triggers the same fear response. No pain required. Father Michael ran gentle hands along Loki's side, checking his reactions with careful, practiced attention. The wounds under his collar. May I see them? Abby lifted the collar carefully, and Father Michael's expression darkened as he examined the scarring. These aren't training injuries, he said quietly. These are deliberate, small, precise punctures consistent with a shock collar device modified beyond standard settings. Someone's been using considerably more voltage than any legitimate trainer would ever consider appropriate. Dante's jaw had gone tight enough that a muscle jumped visibly along his cheek. Marco, he said, the name coming out low and dangerous. I can't confirm who, Father Michael said carefully, but whoever's been handling this dog has spent years deliberately keeping him afraid. Every violent incident you've documented likely followed direct exposure to whatever's triggering that fear response. This isn't an aggressive animal, Mr. Romano. This is a traumatized one, reacting exactly the way any creature would after years of conditioned pain. Dante confronted Marco that evening, and Abby, waiting nervously in the courtyard with Loki curled anxiously against her side, heard raised voices carrying faintly from the estate's main house. Dante's voice, controlled but unmistakably furious, and Marco's, smooth and defensive in return. He emerged 20 minutes later, composed again but visibly shaken, settling heavily onto the courtyard bench beside her. He denies everything, Dante said quietly. Says the wounds are from Loki's own aggressive episodes, self-inflicted through biting at his own collar during panic. Says the beeping is standard training equipment I simply never noticed before, because I'm rarely present for sessions. Do you believe him? I don't know what I believe. Dante's hands clenched loosely in his lap, frustration and grief tangling together in his voice. He's been with this family 15 years, Abby. He was there the night my father died. He helped me hold this entire organization together during the worst month of my life. I don't want to believe he's capable of this. I understand that, but wanting something to be true doesn't actually make it true. Abby kept her voice gentle despite the urgency underneath it. I'm not asking you to convict him based on a hunch. I'm asking you to keep watching, carefully, because whatever's happening to this dog isn't stopping just because we asked polite questions about it. Dante was quiet for a long moment, watching Loki's steady, exhausted breathing where he lay curled against Abby's legs. I'll have security review every recording from the training facility, he said finally, quietly, without alerting Marco that we're looking. Good. And I'd like you to be careful, he added, something protective entering his voice that hadn't been there a moment earlier. If Marco realizes you're the reason I'm asking these questions, I don't know how he'll respond. I've survived worse than an uncomfortable dog trainer, Dante. This isn't the same as an uncomfortable dog trainer. His eyes held hers, serious and unguarded in a way she wasn't quite used to from him yet. Please, just be careful. She was walking home from her shift 2 nights later, cutting through the alley behind Riverside Diner the way she always did, when she overheard a voice she recognized, carrying faintly from beyond a stack of delivery crates. Marco. On the phone, his usual smooth, professional tone stripped away entirely, replaced by something considerably colder. No, she's the problem. The waitress. She's been in his ear for weeks now, asking questions she has no business asking. A pause, listening to whatever response came through the line. I don't care how harmless she looks. She has already noticed the training equipment, the wounds, the pattern. If she keeps digging, she's going to unravel 5 years of careful work in a matter of weeks. Another pause, longer this time. I know what needs to happen. I'm handling it. We need her gone before she ruins everything. Abby's blood turned to ice, her back pressed flat against the cold brick wall. Every muscle in her body gone rigid with the effort of staying silent. Gone. He'd said gone, like it was a logistics problem. Like she was an inventory discrepancy to be resolved, rather than a person. She doesn't have proof, Marco continued, his voice low and clipped. Not yet. But if Dante keeps letting her near that dog, near the records, near anything I've built these past 5 years, she'll find it eventually. She already asked him who's been hurting his dog. Directly. That's not a woman who's going to stop asking questions just because we tell her to. Abby's phone, tucked in her apron pocket, buzzed once against her hip. A text notification, the small sound entirely too loud in the quiet alley. She froze. The voice beyond the crates stopped. I have to go, Marco said quickly, his tone shifting instantly back into something smooth and controlled. I'll handle the waitress. Don't contact me on this line again. Footsteps. Close. Moving toward her. Abby didn't wait to see if he'd round the corner. She backed away as quietly as her shaking legs allowed, slipping through a gap between 2 dumpsters and out onto the main street, her heart hammering so violently she could hear it in her own ears. She didn't stop walking until she reached her apartment 3 blocks away, locking the door behind her with hands that wouldn't quite steady, sliding down against it until she sat on the floor of her own dark kitchen, phone clutched tight in one trembling fist. She had a decision to make, and she suspected she didn't have much time to make it. She could tell Dante everything she'd overheard, the threat, the careful, chilling certainty in Marco's voice, and risk starting a war inside an organization she barely understood, against a man who'd spent 15 years earning trust he'd apparently been quietly betraying the entire time. Or she could stay quiet, dig further on her own first, and risk whatever Marco meant by handling her before she ever got the chance. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. A message from Dante, sent 20 minutes earlier, the same one that had nearly gotten her caught. Security footage review starts tomorrow morning. I want you there when we go through it. I trust your read on his behavior more than I trust my own right now. Abby stared at the screen for a long moment, her decision settling into place with a clarity that steadied her shaking hands. She wasn't going to stay quiet. Not about this. But she also wasn't foolish enough to believe, after what she'd just overheard, that whoever Marco had been speaking to on that phone call was the only person she needed to worry about. Someone out there already knew she was digging. And digging deeper, she understood now, with cold, absolute certainty, had just become considerably more dangerous than she'd ever anticipated when she'd first raised her hand on a crowded sidewalk and told a terrified dog absolutely not. Abby told Dante everything the next morning, sitting across from him in a quiet corner of the estate's study while security technicians prepared the footage review in the next room. His expression hardened with every word, hands curling into fists against the desk by the time she finished. He said, "Gone?" Dante repeated, voice flat and dangerous. "About you." He said he'd handle it. I don't know exactly what that means, and I'd rather not find out. Abby kept her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest since the previous night. But I don't think we can afford to wait for the footage review alone to prove what's happening. If he suspects we're closing in, he'll destroy evidence before we ever see it. Then we move faster. Dante's jaw was tight. I want security on you starting today. Discreet, but constant. I don't need a bodyguard, Dante. You need one considerably more than you did yesterday. His eyes held hers, unwavering. I'm not debating this. The footage review, when it finally began an hour later, revealed frustratingly little. Marco was careful, meticulous, every recorded training session showing only standard equipment, nothing that matched the ultrasonic device Father Michael had described. Whatever he was using, he wasn't using it anywhere the cameras could see. He knows where the blind spots are, Dante said grimly, watching hours of unremarkable footage. He helped design half this security system. He'd know exactly which angles to avoid. Then we need to find where he's actually doing it. Somewhere off the property entirely, maybe. Abby frowned, thinking back through everything she'd learned about Marco's routine over the past weeks. Rosa mentioned once that she'd seen his car near the old industrial district a few times, late at night. I didn't think anything of it before. There's an old dog training facility out that way, Dante said slowly, something clicking into place behind his eyes. It belonged to my father's original security consultant, years ago, abandoned after he retired. I'd forgotten it still existed. That's worth checking. We'll check it, Dante said firmly. Together, not you alone. She went alone anyway. It wasn't defiance exactly, more a calculation Abby made quietly to herself that evening, watching Dante get pulled into an urgent call about a separate business matter that stretched on longer than either of them anticipated. If Marco caught even a whisper that Dante himself was investigating the facility, he'd have time to clear it out before anyone arrived. But a waitress, following a hunch on her own time, attracted considerably less attention. She told herself it was a reasonable risk. She didn't entirely believe it, but she went regardless. The industrial district sat quiet and half-abandoned as the sun dropped low, warehouses standing dark and silent along cracked pavement, weeds pushing through concrete that hadn't seen regular traffic in years. She found the training facility exactly where Rosa's offhand comment had suggested. A low, windowless building, its faded sign barely legible, a single security light flickering weakly above a side door that, to her surprise, opened easily beneath her hand. The air inside smelled of rust and old fear, something she couldn't have named specifically but recognized instantly. The particular staleness of a place that had witnessed considerable cruelty. Abby moved carefully through the dark, phone flashlight held low, and found what she'd been searching for within minutes. Broken cages lined one wall, several still bearing scratches deep enough to have splintered the metal bars. A workbench near the back held equipment she didn't fully understand. Devices with dials and readouts, wires trailing toward collars identical to the one Loki wore every day. Training logs, stacked in careful, obsessive rows, documented years of sessions in Marco's precise handwriting. She photographed everything, hands shaking slightly, her chest tight with a fury that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the small, deliberate cruelty documented in page after page. One entry, dated nearly 5 years earlier, made her stomach turn entirely. Subject remains resistant to standard conditioning. Requires escalated stimulus, following the incident with RR. Behavior since that night has proven considerably more difficult to control than anticipated. The incident with RR Roberto Romano, Dante's father. Abby's breath caught, understanding beginning to arrive in cold, terrible pieces, until headlights swept suddenly across the facility's front windows, an engine cutting off outside, footsteps approaching the very door she'd walked through minutes earlier. She killed her phone's flashlight instantly, pressing herself flat against the shadows behind the nearest row of broken cages, heart hammering so violently she was certain the sound alone would give her away. The door opened. Marco stepped inside, flipping a switch that flooded the space with harsh overhead light, his usual smooth composure entirely absent, replaced by something tight and agitated as he moved directly toward the workbench, gathering documents into a bag with quick, efficient movements. He was cleaning up, erasing evidence before anyone could find it. Abby held perfectly still, watching through the gap between two rusted cage bars, praying the shadows held long enough for him to finish and leave. He didn't leave. Instead, he crossed to the far wall, checking something on a small monitor Abby hadn't noticed before, and she watched, with dawning horror, as his expression shifted from agitation into cold, focused certainty. A motion sensor. She'd tripped one on her way in, apparently, the alert only now flashing across his screen. Marco's eyes lifted slowly, scanning the darkened facility with the deliberate patience of a man who already knew, without a shred of doubt, that he wasn't alone. "I know you're in here," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the empty space. "You should have stayed at that diner, Miss Brooks. Some questions really do get people killed." He crossed to the door, and Abby's stomach dropped as she heard the heavy, unmistakable sound of a deadbolt sliding home from the outside. She was locked in. Abby didn't move until she heard Marco's car engine fade into the distance, her heart still hammering, her hands pressed flat against the cold cage bars to steady herself. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. No signal, not even a single bar. She tried the door anyway, throwing her weight against it, but the deadbolt held firm, exactly as solid as it had sounded sliding into place. She circled the building's interior twice, searching for another exit, but every window had been boarded over years earlier, every alternate door sealed as tightly as the first. She sat down on an overturned crate, forcing her breathing to steady, and tried to think. Dante. She'd told him nothing about coming here alone. He was still on his call when she'd slipped away, and by now, hours later, he'd likely realized she'd gone dark, though she had no way of knowing whether he understood where to look. She didn't have to wait long to find out. A distant, familiar sound reached her first. Not an engine, not footsteps, but a low, urgent barking, growing steadily closer, unmistakable even through the facility's thick walls. Loki. Abby scrambled to her feet, pressing close to the door, and heard Dante's voice moments later, sharp with barely controlled fear. "Abby, are you in there?" "I'm here." She pounded against the metal door with both fists. "I'm okay, but the door's locked from the outside." She heard Loki's frantic scratching against the metal, his bark rising into something desperate, and then the sharp, mechanical sound of the lock giving way beneath tools she couldn't see. until the door finally swung open and Dante stood framed against the darkness, Loki bolting past him to press himself frantically against her legs. "You went alone," Dante said, his voice tight with a fury that barely masked the fear underneath it. "After everything." "I know." Abby knelt to steady Loki, who was trembling nearly as badly as she was. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I found something, Dante. Something you need to see." She led him to the workbench, still scattered with the files Marco hadn't finished gathering, and watched his expression shift as he read the entry she'd photographed earlier. The incident with RR. "That's my father," Dante said quietly, his voice gone hollow. "R. Roberto Romano. 5 years ago, around the same time Loki's behavior changed." Abby's chest tightened, watching pieces click into place across his face in real time. "Dante, what happened the night your father died?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the log entry, something distant and pained entering his eyes. "He was shot," Dante said finally. "In his study. Marco was one of the first people in the room afterward. He'd been in the house that night, part of the security detail." His jaw tightened. Loki was there too. He'd never been allowed in that wing before, but somehow he'd gotten loose. And when we found him, he was… Dante stopped, understanding arriving visibly, painfully, all at once. He was attacking Marco, snarling, lunging, out of control. Everyone assumed grief had made him dangerous. We locked him away for weeks afterward, convinced he'd become a threat to the household. "But he wasn't attacking out of grief," Abby said quietly. "He was trying to attack the person who killed your father." The words hung in the cold, empty facility, heavy and undeniable, 5 years of assumptions collapsing all at once. "Marco," Dante said, the name coming out low and cold. "Marco killed my father. I don't have proof of that yet. Not concrete proof." Abby's hand found his arm, steady despite her own shaking. "But everything fits, Dante. The timing, Loki's reaction that night. 5 years of deliberately keeping him traumatized and unpredictable so nobody would ever trust his instincts again. He made sure no one would believe the one witness who actually knew the truth." Dante's voice had gone dangerously quiet, his hands curling into fists at his sides. 5 years, Abby. 5 years I trusted him, grieved beside him, let him run half my organization while he broke off, breathing hard. Loki pressing anxiously against his legs now, sensing the storm of emotion radiating off him. Abby knelt beside the dog, running steady hands along his back, murmuring soft reassurance, until his trembling eased slightly. "He tried to warn you," she said softly, "the only way he knew how, and instead of listening, everyone locked him away and called him dangerous." Dante knelt slowly beside them both, his hand finding Loki's head with a gentleness Abby hadn't seen from him before. Careful, deliberate, an apology written into every motion. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice cracking slightly. "I should have listened. I should have trusted you 5 years ago, instead of believing the man who was hurting you the entire time." Loki leaned into the touch, tail giving one small, uncertain wag, and Abby felt her own throat tighten watching the exchange. A man finally, painfully understanding the loyalty that had been standing beside him all along, unable to speak, unable to prove anything except through fear and instinct nobody had cared to interpret correctly. "We need evidence," she said finally, gently redirecting the moment before grief could fully overwhelm him. "Real evidence, not just a training log and a 5-year-old memory. If Marco killed your father, there has to be more here, or somewhere else, that proves it definitively." Dante nodded slowly, rising and turning back toward the scattered files still spread across the workbench, gathering what remained with careful, urgent hands. "He didn't finish clearing this place out," he said, "which means whatever's still here might be enough." They worked quickly, photographing every remaining document, every training log, every piece of equipment that matched Father Michael's description, until Dante's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket, and his expression darkened as he read the message flashing across the screen. "It's Vincent," he said grimly. "Marco's back at the estate. He's telling the captains I need to see him immediately. Says it's urgent business regarding the family's financial records." That's not a coincidence. No. Dante's jaw tightened, gathering the last of the evidence into his bag. He knows we were here. He's moving first, trying to control the story before we can tell it ourselves. Abby's stomach dropped, understanding settling cold and certain. What kind of story? Dante didn't answer immediately, already moving toward the door, Loki close at his heels, his expression grim with a certainty that made Abby's pulse quicken with fresh dread. "The kind," he said quietly, "where I imagine you're about to become considerably more than just a waitress who tamed my dog." The Romano estate's main hall had transformed by the time Dante and Abby arrived. A dozen of the family's senior captains gathered in tense clusters, Vincent standing near the head of the room with an expression carefully schooled into neutrality that didn't quite mask his unease. Marco stood at the center of it all, composed and grave, exactly the picture of a loyal advisor delivering unwelcome news. "Dante." Marco's relief looked almost genuine as they entered, though Abby caught the flicker of calculation behind his eyes the moment he registered her presence at Dante's side. "Thank God. We have a serious problem." "So, I've heard." Dante's voice stayed level, giving away nothing. "Enlighten me." Marco gestured toward a table, where several printed documents lay spread out, financial records dense with figures Abby couldn't fully parse at a glance. Confidential account records, missing from the secure archive as of this afternoon. Whoever accessed them bypassed 3 separate security protocols. His eyes flicked toward Abby, brief and deliberate. "I hate to raise this, given everything, but Miss Brooks has had considerable access to this estate over the past several weeks. Unsupervised, in areas well beyond the courtyard." A murmur rippled through the gathered captains, several exchanging wary glances. "That's absurd," Abby said, before she could stop herself. "I've spent every visit with your dog, Marco. You know exactly where I've been, because half the time you were the one glaring at me from across the courtyard. I know where you claim to be." Marco's tone remained maddeningly reasonable. "I can't speak to what happened during the times no one was watching." Vincent stepped forward, dry humor entirely absent from his voice now. "We have a witness who says otherwise. Marco, I'd be careful about the accusations you're making in front of this room." "I'm not making accusations, Vincent. I'm raising legitimate concerns." Marco's composure didn't waver. "This organization has survived 15 years because we protect what belongs to it. A stranger with unexplained access to sensitive records on the exact same day those records go missing isn't a coincidence I'm comfortable ignoring." Dante's jaw had tightened considerably, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "She was with me tonight, Marco, at the old training facility your predecessor abandoned years ago. We found training logs, equipment, documentation of exactly what's been happening to my dog for the past 5 years. The room went very still. "I don't know what you think you found," Marco said, his tone shifting, sharper now beneath the careful surface. "But I'd be cautious about the story you're building here, Dante. Grief makes people see patterns that aren't there. I've watched you struggle with your father's death for 5 years. I understand the impulse to find someone to blame. I'm not looking for someone to blame." Dante's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "I'm looking at evidence, Marco. Evidence with your handwriting on it." Something flickered across Marco's expression, the first genuine crack Abby had witnessed in his composure, before he smoothed it away entirely, turning instead toward the gathered captains with an expression of wounded, patient reasonableness. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years of loyal service, and I'm being accused based on a waitress's word and some old paperwork found in an abandoned building anyone could have planted evidence inside. He shook his head slowly. "I understand emotions are running high, but I'd ask this room to consider carefully whose loyalty has actually been proven. and whose has only just arrived. Several captains shifted uncomfortably, and Abby felt the room's tenuous balance tipping in a direction she didn't like. "Show them the security footage," Marco continued, and Abby's stomach dropped as a screen at the front of the hall flickered to life, grainy footage playing across it. A figure in the estate's archive room, moving with careful, deliberate purpose toward the secure filing cabinets. The figure's face was mostly obscured, but the build, the curly dark hair pulled into a familiar messy bun, the apron still tied at her waist. It looked exactly like her. "That's not me," Abby said, her voice rising with genuine alarm now. "I've never been in that room in my life." "The timestamp says otherwise," Marco said, his voice heavy with manufactured regret. "This afternoon, while you claimed to be with Loki in the courtyard." Whispers spread rapidly through the gathered captains, suspicion hardening on several faces that had been merely uncertain moments earlier. Abby felt the walls closing in, understanding with sudden, sick clarity exactly how carefully Marco had constructed this moment. Evidence planted and manufactured with the same patient precision he'd used on Loki for 5 long years. "That footage is fabricated," Dante said, though even his voice carried a note of strain Abby hadn't heard from him before. "It has to be." "I'd like to believe that too," Marco said, and something in his tone had shifted entirely now, colder, more certain. "But the archive's access logs corroborate the timestamp precisely. I'm afraid the evidence speaks for itself, Dante, however uncomfortable that is for all of us." Abby's pulse hammered, watching the room's mood shift decisively against her, several captains now openly exchanging distrustful glances in her direction. She understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Marco had done. Turned every ounce of suspicion she'd raised against him back onto herself, using fabricated footage to bury the truth before it ever had the chance to fully surface. "I didn't do this," she said, forcing her voice steady, despite the panic clawing at her chest. "I've never touched those records. I don't even know where your archive room is." "Then perhaps," Marco said smoothly, "we should let a formal investigation determine the truth. Given the severity of the accusation, I'd suggest Miss Brooks be detained until the matter can be properly resolved." "Absolutely not." Dante's voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and final. "She's not going anywhere, and this footage will be examined by someone I trust, not by whoever conveniently produced it the same night I found evidence in your handwriting." "You're choosing her," Marco said quietly, something almost incredulous beneath his composed tone. "Over 15 years of loyalty, based on nothing but instinct and a dog's behavior." "I'm choosing the truth," Dante said, his eyes never leaving Marco's. "Something you apparently forgot how to value a long time ago." The room held its breath, tension crackling between them, and Abby felt Loki press hard against her leg from where he'd trailed silently behind them through the entire confrontation. His ears pinned flat, a low, steady growl building in his throat, directed with unmistakable, unwavering focus at the man who'd spent 5 years teaching an entire household to distrust the one witness who'd known the truth all along. Vincent called a recess before the room's tension could fully boil over, dispersing the captains with careful, measured authority that Abby suspected had diffused considerably worse situations than this one. "You have until morning," Vincent told Marco, his usual dry humor entirely absent. "Dante wants that footage reviewed independently. If it holds up, we'll deal with the consequences accordingly. If it doesn't, it'll hold up," Marco said, with a confidence that made Abby's skin crawl, before turning and leaving the hall with unhurried, composed steps. Dante watched him go, jaw tight, before turning back to Abby, some of his careful control finally cracking under the weight of the evening. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should never have let this reach a room full of my captains before we had proof solid enough to withstand exactly what he just did." "You didn't know he'd have fabricated footage ready to go." Abby's hands were still shaking, adrenaline and fear finally catching up with her now that the immediate confrontation had passed. He's been planning contingencies for years, apparently. We're not exactly working from an even playing field. No, Dante agreed grimly. We're not. They spent the remainder of the night in Dante's study, the security footage playing on a loop across his laptop screen while a technician Dante trusted personally, a quiet, meticulous woman named Sarah, summoned despite the late hour, worked through the file's metadata with careful, patient focus. There, Sarah said finally, close to 3 in the morning, turning her screen toward them. The timestamp's been altered. Poorly, if you know what you're looking for. There's a metadata mismatch between the file's creation date and the embedded timestamp overlay. Someone spliced this together from separate footage and layered a fake timestamp on top. Can you prove that conclusively? Dante asked. I can prove it to anyone with basic technical literacy. Yes. Sarah's mouth twitched, something satisfied in her expression. It's not even particularly sophisticated work. Whoever did this was rushing. Relief crashed through Abby so completely her knees nearly buckled, though the reprieve lasted only a moment before Dante's expression hardened further. He's rushing because he knows we're closing in, he said, which means he's going to escalate, not retreat. What do we do with this? Abby gestured toward Sarah's analysis. We present it to the captains in the morning. Publicly, the same way he presented his fabricated footage. Dante's jaw was tight. But that only handles the immediate accusation against you. It doesn't give us proof he killed my father, and it doesn't stop him from trying something considerably more direct if he realizes exposure is imminent. Loki hadn't left Abby's side since the confrontation in the main hall, curled now against her legs on the study's worn rug, while Sarah continued combing through additional security data, searching for anything else Marco might have manipulated. You should sleep, Dante said quietly, settling onto the floor beside her, sometime past 4 in the morning, exhaustion finally visible beneath his usual composed exterior. You've been awake nearly 20 hours. So have you. I'm considerably more used to it. A faint, tired smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. You didn't have to come tonight, after everything Marco accused you of, after he tried to have you detained. I wasn't going to just go home and pretend none of this was happening, Dante. Abby ran a gentle hand along Loki's back, the dog sighing contentedly beneath her touch, despite the tension still thick in the room. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on this one. He's had a rough night too. Dante's gaze followed hers to Loki, something soft entering his tired expression. He's never trusted anyone the way he trusts you, he said quietly. Not even me. Not really. Not like this. That's not entirely true. He trusts you plenty. He just needed someone who wasn't asking him to be brave for once. Someone who'd let him just be scared, without needing him to perform strength he didn't actually have. Abby glanced up, catching Dante's eyes in the low study light. Maybe that's true for people too, sometimes. Something shifted behind his expression, careful and unguarded all at once. I don't know what my life looked like before you walked out of that diner, he said quietly, the words arriving with none of his usual careful composure. 5 years. I ran this organization believing control was the only thing keeping any of it standing. You've spent a few weeks proving me wrong about almost everything. I didn't set out to prove you wrong about anything, Dante. I just wanted to help a scared dog. I know. His hand found hers where it rested against Loki's fur, gentle and hesitant, in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar for a man who commanded rooms without raising his voice. That's precisely why it worked. Abby's breath caught, the exhaustion and fear of the entire night suddenly tangled with something warmer, something she'd been carefully not naming for weeks now, despite every quiet moment building steadily toward exactly this. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance, though the air between them had gone taut with something neither seemed quite ready to voice, until Sarah's voice cut sharply through the study's quiet, urgent, and alarmed. Dante, you need to see this. They crossed to her workstation quickly, and Abby's stomach dropped at what filled the screen. Live security feed from the estate's kennel building, time-stamped mere minutes earlier. Marco, moving quickly through the frame, a tranquilizer gun visible in one hand, approaching the kennel where Loki was supposed to be secured for the night. Except Loki wasn't in the kennel. He was here, in the study, curled against Abby's legs, exactly where he'd been for hours. He doesn't know, Dante said slowly, understanding arriving with cold, sharp clarity. He thinks Loki's still locked in the kennel. He's going after him. Why? Abby's pulse hammered. What does he need Loki for? Dante's face had gone pale, the pieces finally, terribly clicking into place. Loki's the only living witness to what actually happened the night my father died, he said quietly. Marco's spent 5 years making sure nobody believed him. But if we're getting close to proving the truth, a dead dog can't testify against anyone, human or otherwise. His hand tightened around Abby's, urgent now. He's not trying to silence him with fear anymore. He's trying to eliminate him completely. Sarah's screen flickered as Marco reached the empty kennel, his expression shifting rapidly from focused determination to sharp, dangerous confusion when he found it vacant. Before his head snapped up, scanning the grounds with sudden, alarmed urgency, clearly realizing the dog he'd come to silence was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with the one woman he'd already tried, and failed, to eliminate once already tonight. Lock the study, Dante said, already moving, his voice sharp with command. Sarah, seal every exit on this floor remotely. Now. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, and Abby heard the distant mechanical click of security doors engaging throughout the house, though her heart hammered with the certainty that locked doors had never once stopped Marco from getting exactly what he wanted. He knows this house better than anyone besides you, Abby said, pulling Loki closer against her side, the dog's ears already pinned flat, sensing the tension radiating through the room. If he designed half the security system, then he knows which locks he can bypass. Dante crossed to a cabinet near his desk, retrieving a weapon Abby hadn't known was there, his movements suddenly precise and controlled in a way that reminded her, sharply, exactly what kind of man she'd spent the past weeks growing close to. Stay behind me, both of you. The study's lights flickered once, then died entirely, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the faint glow of Sarah's laptop screen. He cut the power to this wing, Sarah said, voice tight. Manual override, not the main grid. He's close. Loki's low growl built steadily in the darkness, his body rigid against Abby's legs, every muscle coiled with an alertness that had nothing to do with fear now and everything to do with recognition. The same instinctive fury she'd witnessed on the sidewalk weeks earlier, finally, fully understood. The study door handle turned slowly. It's locked, Sarah whispered. A soft, mechanical click answered her whisper, the study door swinging inward despite the lock, and Marco's silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the faint emergency lighting glowing dim along the hallway floor. Master override, he said quietly. Tranquilizer gun raised, though his eyes weren't on Dante at all. I designed this system, Sarah. Did you really think a manual lock would stop me? Put it down, Marco. Dante's voice cut through the darkness, steady, despite the danger radiating through the room. It's over. Sarah's already proven the footage was fabricated. The captains will see the truth in the morning. The morning won't matter if the only witness who can contradict my version of events is already dead. Marco's gaze finally shifted, landing on Loki, still pressed rigid against Abby's legs, growling low and steady. Step aside, Miss Brooks. This doesn't need to involve you. It's involved me since the moment you decided I needed to disappear. Abby kept her arm firm around Loki's shoulders, refusing to move. You killed Roberto Romano. Loki knew it. That same night. You've spent 5 years making sure nobody would ever believe him. Something in Marco's composed expression finally, completely cracked. He wasn't supposed to be in that wing, Marco said, voice tight with a fury that had been building for 5 long years. Roberto found out I'd been skimming from the shipping accounts. Small amounts. At first, nothing that should have mattered to a man who had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. But he was going to expose me, strip everything I'd built for this family, throw away 15 years of loyalty over pocket change he'd never even notice was gone. His hand tightened around the weapon. I made a decision in one desperate moment, and that dog nearly destroyed everything I built afterward trying to protect it. So you tortured him instead, Dante said, voice gone deadly quiet. For 5 years. Because he knew the truth, and you couldn't risk anyone believing him. I did what was necessary to keep this family stable. Marco's eyes had gone cold, calculating. And I'll do what's necessary now. He raised the tranquilizer gun toward Loki. The dog moved before anyone else could react, breaking free from Abby's grip and lunging across the darkened study with a speed that belied his size, jaws closing hard around Marco's forearm before the shot could fire. Marco screamed, the weapon clattering to the floor, and Dante crossed the room in 3 long strides, driving Marco backward against the wall with brutal, controlled force. Call security, Dante shouted toward Sarah, pinning Marco's struggling weight against the wall. All of them, now. Loki released his grip only when Abby's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady despite everything. Loki, enough. He's not going anywhere. The dog obeyed instantly, backing away with a low, satisfied growl, taking up a protective position beside Abby once more, while Dante secured Marco against the wall, waiting for the security team's footsteps to finally thunder down the hallway. Vincent gathered the captains again by dawn, the same hall from the night before now filled with a very different energy. Marco restrained near the front of the room, his composure entirely gone, replaced by the sullen silence of a man whose careful web had finally, completely collapsed. Sarah's technical analysis played across the screen first, proving the fabricated footage beyond any reasonable doubt. Then came the training logs from the abandoned facility, laid out methodically across the table. Then, finally, Marco's own confession, recorded clearly on Sarah's phone during the confrontation in the study, every damning word captured for the entire room to hear. I made a decision in one desperate moment. That dog nearly destroyed everything I built afterward trying to protect it. The captain's expressions shifted from disbelief into something considerably colder as the recording played out in full, several exchanging grim, furious glances at a man they'd trusted for 15 years. 5 years, Dante said finally, standing at the head of the room, Loki seated calmly at his side. 5 years, this family believed my father's death was an unsolved tragedy. 5 years. We locked away the one witness brave enough to keep trying to tell us the truth, because it was easier to call him dangerous than to question a man we'd trusted completely. His eyes moved slowly across the gathered captains. That ends today. Marco Bellini will face this family's justice, and Loki's name will be cleared, publicly, in front of everyone who ever called him a monster. The room fell silent, then erupted into low, murmured agreement, several captains rising to offer quiet apologies directly to Abby, whose accusations from the night before dissolved entirely under the weight of undeniable proof. Marco was led away without another word, his 15 years of careful loyalty ending exactly where it had always been heading, exposed, finally, by the one creature he'd never managed to fully silence. 6 months later, the cafe Abby had dreamed about for years finally opened its doors on a quiet corner, 2 blocks from Riverside Diner, sunlight spilling warm across a dog-friendly patio, where rescued animals lounged happily among the regular customers. Loki lay stretched across the patio's cool tile, thoroughly unbothered by the steady stream of strangers who'd once crossed entire streets to avoid him, accepting ear scratches and belly rubs with the shameless enthusiasm of a dog who'd finally, completely forgotten how to be afraid. He's supposed to be greeting customers, Dante said, settling into the chair beside Abby's, watching the dog ignore an entire table of new arrivals in favor of dozing in a warm patch of sun, not sleeping through his shift. He's earned a nap or two, I'd say. Abby smiled, watching Loki's tail thump lazily against the tile the moment she spoke, one eye cracking open just enough to find her across the patio. Considering everything, Dante's hand found hers across the small table, warm and certain in a way that had become effortless between them over the past months. A mafia boss and a waitress who'd built something neither of them had expected to find, forged through fear and evidence, and a dog who'd never once stopped trying to tell the truth. I spent 5 years trying to make him obey me, Dante said quietly, watching Loki finally rise and pad across the patio, ignoring every outstretched hand along the way, until he reached Abby's side and rested his heavy head in her lap, exactly the way he had the very first day they'd met. Turns out, he wasn't looking for someone to command him. He was waiting for someone to understand him. Abby smiled, scratching gently behind Loki's ear, the warm afternoon sun settling over the small, hard-won family they'd built together. "Took you long enough to catch up," she said softly. Dante laughed, a real, unguarded sound, entirely unfamiliar to the man who'd once believed control solved everything. And Loki sighed contentedly between them, finally, completely home. The dog everyone feared turned out to be the only one who never stopped telling the truth. If you want more sizzling mafia romance, the kind packed with action, slow-burn love, and just enough humor to keep you smiling between the danger, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Mafia Boss. New stories drop regularly, and trust me, this one's just the beginning. See you on the next one.